let's get started. So first of all, who am I? I'm the CTO of medical specialty eConsult startup RubiconMD. So in the elevator pitch for what we do is we provide a platform that allows primary care doctors to ask questions and get specialty expertise from specialists across the country. And this ideally helps them avoid unnecessary referrals or improve referrals for their patients. So that's sort of the quick plug from my day job. Um, Also, I have had the privilege of being a technologist-in-residence at Cornell Tech for about 2 years. Cornell Tech is a relatively new university. It's a joint venture between Cornell University and Technion in Israel that was established after winning a bid by Mayor Bloomberg. So we haven't been here very long, but we have been running strong. And I have been working in the small data lab with Deborah Estrin, where we essentially experiment with and pilot various types of interesting technologies, usually around healthcare and well-being. N of one data is, I think, what Deborah likes to call it, or small data is the name of the lab. And out of that, one of the projects that we spun up and that I've had the privilege of leading is ResearchStack, which is what we're going to talk about today, which is an open source project, but we sort of originated it here in the small data lab. And now we're actually in the exciting point of seeing it kind of be assumed, as more of a community project than just our own project. But still early days, and we're kind of seeing how this slowly evolves. But it's pretty exciting. And there's some contact information for me there at the bottom. I'll put my contact information up at the last slide too. If you have any questions about ResearchStack or things that we're working on at Cornell Tech or anything, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to help and to give some guidance. So I guess the best way to start in talking about this is, what is a mobile research study? So a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is ResearchKit and ResearchStack, and you might have heard a lot about ResearchKit, and maybe we've even built in some capacity a research study on mobile phone yourself. But one thing that I really found exciting when we first started looking at doing ResearchStack and looking more carefully at ResearchKit is that it takes a lot of assumptions that you might have had about doing research on mobile phones and kind of takes a step back and innovates on them a bit, what ResearchKit does. And so I think it's worth talking about what is a mobile research study and what makes it successful as a way of understanding more broadly the context of everything that we're going to be looking at today. So let's start by talking about ResearchKit. So ResearchKit was released about a year and a half ago, I believe. It is released by Apple. It is open source. And what it is it's an iOS, so iPhone, iPad framework for creating mobile research study apps. Now, mobile research study apps in themselves are nothing new. We were making various apps to do mobile research in the small data lab. Many other companies and academic institutions were doing it. But what was really exciting about ResearchKit is that as a framework, what it does is provide tools to make it easy to do the things about mobile research apps that are necessary, but frankly, very boring. And by that, I mean sort of the second bullet point here, things like security and privacy and informed consent. So almost any legitimate research study being done, especially in the healthcare field now, needs to have institutional review board approval before it can go forward, to make sure that the participants have a minimal amount of harm and a maximal amount of benefit from the study. And a lot of the things that are required by that, ensuring that the data is secure and the way that it's transmitted, that there's the lowest amount of like collecting the least amount of private data needed from the participant for the study, et cetera. Like, those things are very important, but when you set out to want to build a mobile research study because you're trying to understand something, they kind of feel like an afterthought. And so you end up burning a lot of time on doing this thing that just feels like an overhead. And on top of that, one of the most important parts of IRB research is informed consent. So it's letting that participant know what they're getting into, what the purpose of the study is, how their data will be handled, all these things. And you have to have it when you onboard these users. And again, that's also an afterthought. I mean, in a lot of mobile research studies I've seen prior to ResearchKit, we built an app that we sent out there, and then we just asked the doctor to do informed consent with the patients, and they just sat there and read through a form with them. So it's hard to see how well the patient really understood what they were being informed about, and it also just created a kind of unenjoyable experience that made them perhaps less thrilled to participate in the research. So, as I understand it, some of the early impetus for ResearchKit came from a nonprofit out in Seattle named Sage BioNetwork, where some people were working on trying to create a better informed consent process. And a lot of that is something you can see in ResearchKit. So when you open up a ResearchKit app, it shows you a couple of screens with important bits of information of the important things you want to know about the study, the things that like what you would want to have highlighted for you. It gives you a quiz to make sure you understood all those things and what the potential risks you're getting involved in by participating in the study are. And then it later on goes through and captures your signature, emails you that IRB document, etc. This kind of gets to the third bullet point here, which is an opinionated user interface. So Sage worked on this. They worked on it with Apple. They built this really well. And one of the great things about ResearchKit is because they built it so well, they provide some rails of how this should look and how it should feel. And now, if you want to build a mobile research study, you don't have to think about how to do that all over again. It's a user interface that's heavily opinionated in that it kind of tells you exactly what you should be doing, and you fit your information into that box. And this is great not only because it's less work for you to build this app, but also because it maintains a consistent experience across all ResearchKit apps. If you've gone through this experience with one ResearchKit mobile research study, you'll feel the very similar when you go for a second one. And that's just a really good way of kind of treating users and making them feel comfortable with these apps and being involved in research studies, which hopefully leads to greater recruitment and reach. And then the fourth bullet point here is what we're going to spend a lot of the time talking about, so I'm going to just gloss over it now. But a lot of this can be abstracted into something called JSON, which is short for JavaScript Object Notation. And you don't have to care about what it means, other than that it's a configuration file where even if you're a non-programmer and have no experience with computers and hate technology, you can figure out how to configure this to make it work the way you want and be able to either create or update or maintain your own research study without having to have a computer science degree from MIT or Caltech or what have you. So it will be easier to understand this to look in the context of an actual ResearchKit app. So I'm going to look at it very, very briefly in the context of MoleMapper, and a lot of the examples today are going to be from MoleMapper. I had the privilege of working with the various groups of people behind MoleMapper, including Dan Webster, who sort of came up with the idea, and bringing it from iOS to Android. So I'm quite familiar with it, and I think it's a good example to talk from. MoleMapper is an app that you can download on your iPhone, and very, very soon, as in the next week or so, on your Android phone if you have one. And it helps participants monitor and record the growth and location of moles. So you have a mole on your arm, you take a photo of it, you measure it in the app, and then a week later, the app says, hey, you should check it on this photo again. Take another photo, you measure it again, and you can see if that mole is growing or not. Now, this is interesting because that's something that you personally would like to have access to, that data that you'd want to keep and refer to. But it also is valuable because it contributes to melanoma research. That data about mole growth and location, as well as some survey questions that are asked of the participants. How much time have they spent in the sun recently? Did they wear sunscreen, etc.? All of that is collected and sent to a research database run by the melanoma research team at Oregon Health and Science University. And from there, and on top of that, you as a participant can download your data, you can transfer it to another location, and you can know how your data will be used and shared and what the risks are ahead of time, because this is all IRB-backed research. And what's very interesting about MoleMapper is, I think, how it started and what that kind of suggests about mobile research apps generally. And this is a little bit of a digression, but Dan Webster told me that he built the app originally for his wife, who is fair-skinned and has a family history of melanoma. And she was concerned about tracking her own moles, so he wanted to create a tool for her to do that. And from there, it sort of spun out to it got some attention, and Sage offered to be involved in it. They brought Oregon Health and Science University on board. ResearchKit was in the developmental stages at that time, so then it kind of went to becoming a ResearchKit based app, and they helped Dan build it out to that. And the point was that it was originally built as an app that helped an individual and gave them something that they wanted to track or have access to their own data, a positive feedback loop, so to speak, that also was valuable for research and ended up being attached to this research study at Oregon Health and Science University. And so if there's one interesting theme that's emerged in the work that I've done at ResearchStack, is that a lot of the most successful mobile research studies that I've talked to start off being research studies or start off being apps that would had a use for participants and have kind of, as a result of that, become apps first and research studies second. They get their success from having this positive feedback loop that is interesting to the participant as a user, and that creates a virtuously large amount of data for the researchers that are analyzing the back end. But we'll talk about this a little bit more at the end. It's a bit of a digression. So the problem with ResearchKit is it does everything great, except it only does it on Apple and iPhone. And for us in the Small Data Lab, we were very excited when ResearchKit came out, but this was a problem because we were already running studies or pilots, technologies that were being used in studies by organizations like Weill Cornell, Hospital for Special Surgery, and those were both on iOS and Android. Sometimes more of the participants were Android users than iOS users, because there are just certain socioeconomic demographics that iOS does not capture very well, and that are much better represented in Android. And oftentimes these are demographics that are generally underrepresented in research and that you want to have in your research study to be able to have a more representative sample. Also, and this is something I discovered more as we started to build it, Android has much stronger reach in international populations. In the US, iOS, you can get away with just having an iOS-based study, but we get a lot of queries from researchers that are working for major companies or academic institutions in India and in Europe. And, most of the people that they need to be serving in these studies are on Android. And one thing that was very useful about being cross-platform is that right now Apple makes ResearchKit open source and anyone can fork it, but they're still very much kind of in control of that project. And as a personal opinion, I think that to have a very sustainable long-term framework, it has to be more community-driven than driven by any one institutional organization. And so by creating an Android port of ResearchKit, it kind of provides an opportunity for Apple to continue having ownership of what they're doing with ResearchKit, which has been great, but also for there to be some general more community involvement in mobile research platforms as a whole. So these were all thoughts that we had when ResearchKit came out, and we thought in the Small Data Lab, wow, it would just be great if there was an Android version. Someone's going to build it eventually. We just have to wait for it. And we waited, and we realized that the someone who should probably be building it was us, because we had been building we've been building research studies for a while, and we were very much invested in Android as well as in iOS. So we were fortunate to be able to we were fortunate enough to be able to go to Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and get a grant for them to help us to build out ResearchStack and to make this a reality. And when we started forward on it, we had a few goals of what we wanted to do. Besides just making a ResearchKit port to Android, there are some things that we thought were very important in building an Android framework for mobile research studies. And the first and most important, and I think the underwriting philosophy of ResearchStack, is to make it as little work as possible to build a cross-platform mobile study. Nobody likes to do all this work twice. I mean, I don't think anyone even really likes to do it once. So we wanted to find a way to reuse as much as you could from an existing ResearchKit study so that bringing it to Android would be relatively low overhead and straightforward. And along these lines, we wanted to make it so you could just drop these configuration files from ResearchKit straight into ResearchStack and create an Android app from them. We also wanted to provide an opinionated user interface and style guidelines that were more attuned to the way that users on Android expect to see things, because there's some cultural differences between the two platforms. We wanted to make it secure and private by default, which is very important, and which is frankly one area where things are a little bit trickier in Android. The Android ecosystem is more open, which is great, allows for you to collect a lot more types of interesting data, but it's also something of its Achilles heel because it makes security and privacy something that you have to be especially detail oriented and focused on. And so we wanted to just lay the groundwork for all of that. And we also wanted to create a community for creating plugins and extensions like custom tasks, and I will talk about that in a little bit. So that is a lot of information dumped on you about both ResearchKit and ResearchStack. And I think much more enjoyable than just talking about these frameworks abstractly and what they can do and why they're important is to build a mobile research study and a cross-platform one. So let's try this. So if we're going to build a mobile research study, I think at the very minimum we need to have two, maybe three things. One is what we talked about before with IRB consent, IRB review. We want to have to go through this consent process. We want to inform the users about risks and benefits, ensure they understand what they're getting into, make sure that they can unenroll, all those nice things. We want to have surveys, because you could run, and many research studies do run, on nothing but just asking people surveys and getting information from them and using that information to kind of understand a demographic better, or a condition, or to, let's say, evaluate phenotype data or whatever. A lot of things can be done with just surveys. And you want to have alerts. You don't necessarily need to have these, but many surveys are time-based, so you want to ask a person a question 1 week, and you want to check in a week later, and then a week after that, and you want to see how that data compares over time. And because the average research study participant isn't, eagerly checking their app, their research study app every day to see what new surveys they should be taking, these alerts can alert them, just on their home screen or when they wake up in the morning to do this particular thing. So let's look at how we can build all three of these things without having to actually do any real programming. So here you have what is a typical consent flow. So here's a screenshot. These are both from the Mole Mapper app. Let me go on to the little laser pointer here. Okay. And what you're seeing here is a stage in the quiz part of the consent flow. So you already told the user all the basic information about what this research study is doing, the risks and harms, and you're giving them a quiz to say, okay, do you understand these points? And if they don't understand, you want them to go through the consent flow again so they can understand them. You don't want someone to sign up if they don't really know what they're getting into. So here you're asking them a question about if there's identifiable information that they might, if there's a tattoo, they might be identified from their photos, even though it's supposed to be anonymous data. And here the user had clicked false, and it says, no, you gave the wrong answer. We can't guarantee that every mole is going to be anonymous. And all of this is created over here with this sort of colorized text that I marked up, and which is, I think if you just look at it, something that you could figure out without needing a lot of explanation. But to make it even clearer, there's a breakdown here of where all this piece of the configuration information is being rendered here in the screen. You see the prompt is the question that comes out here. Is the type of question is Boolean, which is a very fancy programming way of saying it's a true-false question. You have an expected answer. You're expecting them to say true. That's the correct answer. And if they say true, you have positive feedback, which doesn't appear in the screenshot because this person clicked the wrong answer. And if they don't click true, then you give them this negative feedback. You tell them why the answer is not correct. And that's that. You created this whole screen and this quiz flow with just putting some data in here. And this one field here at the top, identifier, is really just an arbitrary, unique, string of letters that can help the computer identify this question and how it's different than other questions. All right. So that is creating a simple consent flow. Now let's take a look at a survey. So a survey is very similar. And then here you have a survey that's a monthly mole survey. You're asking some questions about if they've had any moles removed, how people's health has generally been, and how this renders here. The middle screen is the iOS version, the right screen is the Android version. And again, what you're seeing here is pretty much what you saw before. This information here at the top is the information about the survey generally. So you give it an identifier, you're saying it's a survey type. There's another, you're having a second name here to kind of more explicitly, this is for the computer to be able to recognize what you're doing. And then the elements here are basically all the questions of the survey. And this little fancy square bracket here does it denote that this is an array. An array is an even fancier way of saying it's a list of things. And what you're doing is just listing a bunch of questions. And so the question you see here is rendered here. And it's saying, hey, did you have any moles removed in the past month? True, false. And that data, when the user inputs it, and you don't have to do anything, is captured and stored in the database on the phone for being sent to your research database later. All right, so that is consent and surveys. Let's tie these all together. And what you're going to want to have kind of to tie all of your surveys into one place is a home screen in your app. So kind of a main menu that lists all the surveys that need to be taken here, or other tasks that need to be done. And we're going to talk about tasks right after this. And so here, this is actually not a screenshot from MoleMapper. This is from Asthma Health, because it has more surveys. MoleMapper only has a monthly survey. So the right one's the MoleMapper Android. This is Asthma Health on iOS. And what you see over here on the left is a very simple representation of, okay, we have an About You survey. It has 15 questions. This is just helpful to let the user know how long it's going to take. This is the name of it. And for the computer, APH Daily Task View Controller, you don't really need to worry about that. And let's just do this once. We only need to collect this demographic information from the user once. So once they do the survey and they complete it, they never need to see it again. A little bit more interesting down here is you have this recurring survey. So this is this one that happens every month. And again, it looks pretty much the same. The only thing here that seems maybe a little bit very computer program wonky is this schedule string, which is basically saying every month at 12 o'clock on the first day of the month, ask the user to take this survey. And it's represented in what's called cron syntax. And you can Google it and figure out how to create it. I would recommend just finding a programmer friend, preferably one that uses Linux, and asking them to do it for you. But that's it. So if you just list all those surveys you created here, they will pop up in the main screen. They will alert the user every week or month or what have you, and you have built a simple mobile research study. You just take these configuration files, and there's some examples I'll link to later, and you drop them into the ResearchKit and ResearchStack sample app frameworks, and you can get running. Of course, it's not all that easy, and I simplify things a bit, partially to encourage you, but also because it is much easier than you might think it is, kind of coming at it blind. But there's one thing, of course, that people ask about all the time, and I think that is at least superficially the most exciting thing about ResearchKit. I still think the most exciting thing is about the way they abstracted out all the security and consent flows and made that just so simple. But there's one really exciting thing, which is the different ways you can use a mobile phone to collect data. You have all these different sensors, all these different inputs. You don't just have to ask survey questions anymore. There's a lot more you can do. And here's a bunch of examples of them. And within ResearchKit and ResearchStack, we call these tasks. So I'm going to continue to call these tasks going forward. They're basically ways that you can use the mobile phone to collect data that tells you something beyond what the user can self-report. And most of these examples you see here are from the Empower Parkinson's study, which was released by Sage. The one on the left, someone says ah into a microphone. It tests what vocal variations that they have for as long and how long they can hold saying that. The second one is a spatial memory test. The third one is not from Empower. I think this is the 6-minute walking test. You put the phone in your pocket, you walk around for 6 minutes. It measures gait, it measures number of steps. It's kind of a good proxy for fitness and a bunch of other things you may want to be measuring in your participants. And the fourth one is a tapping test for dexterity, for manual dexterity. Honestly, I don't want to say the sky is the limit, but the mobile phone is definitely the limit with these studies. If you can come up with an interesting study, and let's say you wanted to do a task where you ask the user to hold their phone as high as possible over their head to test out joint flexibility, you could build it. And it's not, the problem with building tasks is that they're not as easy as just configuring things, as you were saying just now, surveys. But the exciting thing about the configuration for surveys and consent flows is now you can just focus on hiring a programmer, or if you're a programmer, building yourself these tasks and just focus on the logic of what you're doing. And so tasks are one thing that's also interesting about them is within both ResearchKit and ResearchStack, there's a narrow way that they're expected to be built. And so if someone has built a task before you, if let's say you have a study that you want to use a tapping test in, you can just go find where they built it, how they built it, and copy and paste that code into your own mobile research study. I mean, assuming that they made open source, and all the ones you see here are open source. And that's because ResearchKit and ResearchStack provide kind of narrow guide rails of how these things should be done so they can be interchanged. And so even though tasks require quite a bit of work and some custom programming and things like that, what's very exciting is that you can build out an ecosystem of them, and that's what we're kind of putting a lot of our efforts into right now, where researchers can build these tasks themselves, share them, discover them, even tweak what other people have done to make it work for their research study or to improve upon how it's created. And ResearchKit has a number of tasks available out there, and now ResearchStack, or calling them collectively Research Suite. There's more and more that work that are available for both the iOS and Android. So we have the 6-minute walking test is coming out soon. That's being worked on by a group in Stanford and Oxford. Here in Cornell Tech, we've done one called Yodel, which is your activities of daily living. So it's a photographic survey input, where you can choose from a list of photos of activities you do every day. And then later on, let's say you're studying pain, chronic pain in particular users. Those users can be presented with those photos and say, okay, these are the activities today I did that caused me to feel chronic pain. As a much better way of capturing that data from people than text and typical surveys. Another photographic input that we have is called PAM, Photographic Affect Meter, which takes the traditional 16 affect input questions and lets you just choose a photo that has been tested with groups of people to kind of correspond to that feeling, rather than try to figure out if your mood today was melancholy. You just look at 16 photos and choose the one that seems to most represent your mood. And then I know that Duke University is working on adapting a lot of psychological assessments from PTSD Coach to ResearchStack, and there's a lot more being worked on out there by everyone from, I think, Harvard Pilgrims University, Mount Sinai, etc. So what's really exciting is that before, if people were building research studies out there and they had a 6-minute walking test in it, maybe they would share the code with you, but it was very difficult to take that and adapt it to what you want to do. Where we're headed is it's not going to be easy to build these tasks, but once they're built, it's going to be easy to share them. And if you want to recreate what someone else has done, or if you think that this input is very interesting, you can just bring it straight into a research study that you're building. And a lot of it is going to be as easy as declaring it here in this schedule configuration. So it's not going to be almost any more extra programming work that's required. All right. And so one more difficult thing about making this all work is you still have to hook it up to a backend, by which I mean you have a research database you want this data to come to. It has to have some way to get that data from the app. It takes a little bit of work to make someone's mobile phone and your research database do a handshake and talk to each other. But the good news is that ResearchKit, ResearchStack, they're both backend agnostic. They can plug in with any database that you want. Some of them are more work than others, but there's 3 out there that I'm aware of that have been doing this for a while. They kind of put down pretty pretty good tracks that others can follow in. One is Sage, which I've mentioned a few times here already. They have a backend called Bridge Synapse. They can provide a hosted version. Sage is a nonprofit, so you can contract with them for them to host it, or you can just use the open source version and host it yourself. IBM Watson, I know a little bit less about, except for secondhand, but IBM is built Watson a while ago. They're very much interested in using it to analyze health data. They're providing an API and making it easy for ResearchKit and hopefully soon ResearchStack to talk to Watson. And I2B2, which is probably the oldest database mentioned here in this list. It's been around for a long time for all sorts of biological medical research. And there's an adapter called C3 Pro that is maintained by a group at Harvard Pilgrims, and they have the adapters for both ResearchKit and ResearchStack. So you have 3 very great options you could choose from here. And if you already have a database in-house, you could just implement this to work with that, although I don't recommend it if you don't have something that you're already using. And so kind of coming to a point of wrapping up a bit, we're starting a bandwagon. I listed 3 organizations here that all have apps coming out or already out on both ResearchKit and ResearchStack. Oregon Health Science University has MoleMapper. Cornell Tech, we have something coming out very soon. We actually have a few coming out, some of them in conjunction with others. Harvard Pilgrims is working on one with a major government institution. And there's a few more that have stuff in the works and was about to be released soon, but I didn't get their sign off to put their logos here. So they remain kind of, implicitly mentioned. And, the only group that's not on the bandwagon right now that I am concerned about is yours. So, a lot of what this presentation is about is not just introducing ResearchKit, ResearchStack, but convincing, you, anonymous person on the other end of this webinar, that this is something that you can do. I mean, if you're here and you're interested in mobile research studies, you're interested in taking your research to the next step or working with other people on studying something, I want to say that, maybe it might be a little bit difficult to get going initially, but you feel free to email me or other people that are on the ResearchStack team, and anyone can do this. You could create a simple mobile research survey-based study or use existing tasks and build something amazing. So we want you to join us and kind of push this momentum forward as we bring mobile research into the new millennium, or let's say millennium. And so even if you aren't planning a research study or you don't think this is for you, though, I'm going to just wrap up here with a few thoughts to ponder, to engender some interesting Q&A possibly. And so to throw some things out there, one of them I talked about before, what are the implications of this idea of mobile research studies starting to make research into being an app first and a study second? If we're engaging people to create data for research studies by creating a feedback loop for them, helping them track their own moles or helping them track their own asthma flare-ups or whatever, how is that going to change the way that research studies generally are done and thought about, and possibly, the sort of IRB implications that they would have? It's one thing that I've had the pleasure of thinking a lot about over the past more than a year of working on ResearchStack now. Another one is these JSON configuration files you've been seeing before. Do they have the potential for being a standard for representing all of these studies? I think that there's a couple of basic components of what any study is and what it involves. And if we're creating a standard language for talking across 2 platforms, could it become a standard language for talking, just representing what any study is in the future? Something that you could append to any, research that you publish to kind of show what your methods were and what you were collecting. Something that can live long beyond iPhones and Android phones to whatever the future might hold for, our grandchildren or their children. Is this potentially a common theme or string to representing what a research study is? And last, how might the open source nature of these platforms, because both ResearchKit and ResearchStack and most of, if not all of the tasks that are available on them are open source, meaning anyone can use them and change them for their own purposes. I mean, will that that openness bleed into sort of the research ecosystem, which is already very open, mind you, generally though, but like, is there going to be an expectation in the future as these mobile research studies begin, hopefully, to be more of a mainstay of published research, that anyone can look at all the code of the research study someone ran and see exactly what they did and just boot up the app to recreate the study right there from the code that they have? How might this conjunction of computer science and research change the way that research is done, as well as possibly the way that computer science is done? So that is the presentation. Thank you everyone for bearing with me.